Hello and welcome once more to Conscious TV. My name is Iain McNay and my guest today is Iain McGilchrist. Hi Iain.
Hello Iain.
And Iain has written what has turned out to be a classic book about the brain. And the full title is The Master and His Emissary, The Divided Brain and the Making of the Western World. And it came out in hardback, now on paperback, and I'm told there's a new paperback edition. So, and there's also an e-book, which also I read and I found very accessible because the e-book is quite a short book, The Divided Brain and the Search for Meaning, because this is a weighty tome, about 400,000 words. So you need more than a wet Sunday afternoon for this one to get through it. So Iain, you've had quite a checkered life. You live on the Isle of Skye, and I've been once to the Isle of Skye. I found it a very beautiful place.
Yes,
I know you live quite remotely.
Yeah.
And you were working as a psychiatrist in London.
That's right.
For many years.
Yes.
But this book took you 20 years, and
Yes.
it's very much not only a labour of love, but it's something that's driven you, hasn't it, to put it all in writing?
I think it has. It was one of those things that I wanted to do before I died, and I didn't particularly mind about anything else. It's a book whose, I suppose, the drive for which goes back a long way. I've never really bought from my teenage years onwards the reductionist account of the world. In particular, I remember doubting that the sum of the parts was the same thing as the whole, before I had any way of articulating that. And I remember also thinking that that nature and the world around us was not inanimate or inert, but responsive to us, and that our attitude to it made a difference. I also remember at school, where Plato was very important, being told that Plato held that all the things that we have in this world are just a sort of pale shadows, really, imperfect copies of abstract ideas. And I equally heard that Aristotle thought almost the reverse, that our ideas are drawn from our experience. And it always seemed to me that I was an Aristotelian. And because of these interests, I went up to Oxford with an intention of studying theology and philosophy, but in fact I ended up, for various reasons, studying literature. And then I was lucky enough to get a fellowship at All Souls College, which gave me 7 years in which to pursue other interests. And I went back to philosophy and psychology, this time with an emphasis on the mind-brain problem, if you like to call it that. And that was partly because in my study of literature, it had occurred to me that people had taken great pains to create a work of art, a poem, a novel, a piece of music, a painting, whatever it might be, that was something concrete. It wasn't just an idea or a concept. It was individual, it was instantiated exactly as it was in the way that it was, and it couldn't be better understood as a paraphrase. So it was individual, it was embodied, and it was unique. And we were turning it into things that were general and abstract and actually very banal, because when you take the ideas out of a poem, or you start taking apart its form, you're left with a handful of bits and pieces that really don't account for why you love it. And this seemed to me to have something to do with the way we were thinking about it, if you like, in the sort of way a computer might approach it. We weren't approaching it in an embodied way. And I felt that it was to do with things like the effects that the work of art had on our pulse and our respiration and all the rest. So I thought I'll explore the mind-body problem, and I had lots of time to read the philosophers. And in a nutshell, I found them just too disembodied in their approach. It was the sort of stuff you could do in a seminar room. But really the way to get a handle on this was to have, as near as possible, direct experience of what happens when something changes in the body or the brain and it affects the mind, or something goes on in somebody's mental, psychic life and it affects their body. And that, of course, meant studying medicine, so I did that. And then afterwards, I was obviously interested in the overlap between neurology and psychiatry, so I did a bit of neurology, then went to the Maudsley Hospital in London to become a psychiatrist. And that was where I met somebody who set me thinking very much about this topic.
Yeah. So when you mentioned the mind and the brain, briefly, what's the distinction as you see it between the mind and the brain?
Well, that's, as you know, an extraordinarily difficult question to answer.
That's what I said briefly.
I think they're different modes of being of the same thing. And that is not to say, to imply all sorts of things about the mind, that it can somehow be reduced to matter. If you bring two things together, one of which you think of as exalted and the other you think of as lowly, the union of the two as much exalts the lowly term as it threatens to demystify the elevated term. So in bringing mind and matter together, to me the excitement is about matter. What is matter? People say the consciousness problem. Well, what problem? I mean, there can be no problem with consciousness, because it is, and in this Descartes was right, the single thing that we know for certain, we inhabit consciousness. But what is matter? I mean, that's another matter. This chair resists my consciousness in some way, and that is very intriguing. So I think of matter as, if you like, a phase of consciousness. Now, I don't mean phase in terms of time, I mean it in the way that physicists use it. You know, water, for example, has three phases. It has the gaseous phase, in which it's vapor, it has the liquid phase, in which it's water as we recognize it, and it has the solid phase, in which it's ice. And it seems to me that, in a way, matter is a conjugate of consciousness. And in that it's not too far from some Oriental traditions. So mind and matter, there must be the potential for mind in matter if you are a materialist. If you take the view there is nothing but matter, you've then got to say, okay, matter is a pretty extraordinary stuff, because after a couple of million years it gives rise to the B minor mass. You know, how did that happen? So I don't think we get round it, we've just kicked the can down the road. So I'm going to disappoint you here, I'm not going to give you the answer to the question, because I don't actually have it, but I think I can go some way towards saying what the relationship between mind and matter is like, and what it's not like.
Okay. So your book is essentially about the brain. So the brain is a pretty complex mechanism.
Yes.
It's an intriguing invention, if you like.
Yes.
And the key, the book, seems to me that is the prefrontal context, the
prefrontal
cortex, where we have that and most animals don't have that. And the left and the right hand side of the brain is very much based on that, isn't it? The prefrontal cortex.
Well, animals and birds going a very long way down the phylogenetic tree to really what we would think of as quite lowly creatures have lateralization. They have asymmetries. So even some sea snakes, for example, and fish and so on. So it's not just humans that have lateralized brains and that benefit from them. There's an adage in biology, asymmetry pays, and this goes a long way down the line, as I say, to reptiles, mammals and birds. On the other hand, the advent of the prefrontal cortex, which is not an all or nothing affair. I mean, there's vestiges of this in animals we think of as much less highly evolved. But there is a dramatic change, you are absolutely right, when one comes to the great apes. For example, a dog has 7% of its brain is frontal cortex. A monkey, 17%. But when you get to the great apes, the gorillas, the chimpanzees, bonobos, and humans, it's 35%. And why is this so very important? Well, the answer is it gives distance to life. If you imagine a level of life at which one is almost a set of reflexes, so that certain stimuli give rise to certain responses pretty much willy-nilly, then there isn't very much room for the creature to have developed an individual way of interacting with the world or ability to think about it. They just respond. But what we need in order to understand what's going on is a little bit of distance. We need to stand back. And it's the frontal cortex, and in particular the prefrontal cortex, which just means the most forward part of the frontal cortex, that delivers this for us.
From what I understand, it gives us the potential to stop reacting automatically like an animal might react. So it gives us a, as you say, a distance and a potential to be different.
That's right. And to stand back from the world in order to understand how to interact with it.
Yes.
Famous neuroscientist Ledoux said, you know, it's not what the cortex, indeed, and never mind the frontal cortex, does that matters. It's what it achieves the capacity not to do that matters. So we don't have to respond in certain ways. We can stop ourselves and think, now, I'd be better off actually not to do that, but to think about future consequences, patterns I learnt in the past, perhaps even empathizing enough to understand what's going on in the mind of this other creature, and form an alliance rather than just bite.
Yeah, and we have this tool, this ability, and we'll come on to it later in the program, but sadly as a human race we don't seem to be really maximizing at all this tool that we have. So let's go a little bit more detail then on what the left-hand side does and what the right-hand side, or the capacity of the right-hand side and the left-hand side.
Yes, well, it's going to be tricky doing this very quickly, but I'll do my best. The first thing really to say is that a lot of people come to this book with the idea that they've already heard about differences between the hemispheres.
Yes.
And they've got this idea that probably the left brain is the rational one and the right brain is sort of somewhat impulsive and emotional. And that the left brain, or the left hemisphere, is the linguistic one, the one that deals with language, and the right hemisphere deals only with images. And this sort of stuff emerged in the 60s and 70s and was really the beginnings of an attempt to understand the difference. But then as time went on, people decided that none of these things were true. There came out evidence that every one of those generalizations is false. And to cut a long story short, it is now clear that absolutely everything that we think of as functions of the mind, as thinking about it like a machine, that it does language, or does reason, or does emotion, or does visuospatial things, or anything else you like to say, they are all represented in both sides of the brain. So that distinction is wrong. And that has given the whole topic a bad name. A lot of neuroscientists have just sort of thought there can't be any difference. But that's actually a non-starter, because, as I say, even in animals there is this well-known adage, laterality pays. Animals whose brains are not asymmetrical and who use the two halves of the brain therefore relatively identically tend not to thrive. So there's something important there, and it's there, of course, in humans. And because of the prefrontal cortex, it gets to have very much more meaning, that difference. And I should perhaps comment a little bit about the structure of the brain. And I apologize if this is rather simple for those who know a lot about the brain. But
no, keep it simple. I think that's important.
Okay. So the brain is a very large mass of neurons that are infinitely complexly interconnected. And when I say infinitely, we think there are more potential connection pathways in the brain than there are particles in the universe. So the potential is enormous.
Repeat that again, because that's extraordinary.
It is, yes. So well, there are more possible pathways in the brain through the possible neuronal connections than there actually are particles in the known universe. So,
well, this is just extraordinary figure of trillions and trillions and trillions.
It is trillions and beyond what the human mind can conceivably imagine. So, I mean, of course, not all of them are going to be activated in any one human brain, or even could be, but nonetheless, that potential is there. Yeah. Now, in this organ, which exists only to make these connections, that's what its power exists in, there is a whopping great divide down the middle of the brain, which is evident to every medical student on their first day in medical school. But by the time they've graduated, nobody will have mentioned or raised the question, why is there this divide?
So you see this divide physically?
Yes. Yep. It's like a walnut. I mean, it's a cliched image, but it does quite well. It's a bit like a walnut. If you take a walnut apart, it's two wrinkly masses and a divide down the middle, and you take them out. So it's a bit like that. And one might say, well, you know, it's just the way the brain evolved. But actually, that doesn't hold water for a start, because, well, a number of things, lots of things start in parts. In the fetus, and then get joined up very nicely in the adult or in the neonate by the time you're born. So, for example, the skull starts off as, I think, 16 different bones, and by the time you're born, it's got down to whatever it is, 4, and then, by the time you're 1.5 or 2, it's a single mass. So if we'd wanted to, if evolution had found it useful, it would have been a single mass. And actually what we find is that over the course of evolution, these two halves of the brain have become more distinct in the sense that the volume of the hemispheres has grown faster than the corpus callosum, which is a body of fibres at the base of the brain, which is the main, not the only, but the main source of communication between the two halves of the brain.
Yeah.
And so there's something going on there. And as I say, I had literally never heard anybody in medical school or out ask the question, why? I mean, nature doesn't do things for fun. It doesn't give away a potential for no reason. There must be something that is potentially very important about having this division. And that becomes clear when you learn that transmission of nerve impulses across the corpus callosum, although initially excitatory in many cases, in probably the majority of cases end up acting as inhibitory. And you can actually see this sometimes when you image a brain, that there is activity going on in a certain region, and you see very, very shortly afterwards a brief excitation in the other hemisphere, if you like, in the same place, and then followed by a prolonged inhibition, as though the message was, please keep out of this, I'm better dealing with this on my own. And that set me thinking, that and the fact that, as I say, asymmetry is so important. And indeed there are brains, I researched this at Johns Hopkins back in the 90s, for example, the brains of people with schizophrenia that lose the normal asymmetry. Their brains are perhaps abnormally symmetrical.
So you can see this.
You can actually see it and measure it.
Okay.
And in some cases reversed. Now, it may not be true of every single individual with a diagnosis of schizophrenia. I'm talking as a very significant statistical observation that they either lose or reverse the asymmetry. And there are people such as Tim Crowe in Oxford who think that probably many of the phenomena of schizophrenia are to do with this abnormal lateralization of the brain. And I wouldn't be surprised if he's right. So it's not good enough to say there isn't a difference. And indeed, if you measure the brain in all sorts of ways that are entirely reliable, you'll find the two hemispheres are reliably different in weight, different in shape, have different patterns on the surface, the so-called gyral patterns, have different architecture of the cells in certain regions of the brain, respond differently to neuroendocrine hormones, have different grey to white matter ratios, and even use preponderantly different neurotransmitters. So it's just psychiatrically, scientifically, a non-starter to say there isn't a difference. Added to which, if everybody who's a clinician knows that if you have a stroke in one half of the brain, or you have the stroke in the other, there will be very different consequences. So let's get rid of the cheap thing that is bandied around all over the place. There is no difference. There is a difference. It's just a question of what is that difference. And getting at that involved observation of birds and animals, because while human neuroscientists have been frightened off by the Volvo ad, a car for your right brain, oh, it's too tacky, we can't go there. Animals and bird ethologists had been doing what scientists are supposed to do, which is just to observe. And they had noticed that birds and animals use their right and their left hemispheres for different purposes. What is the main difference that one can see? It's to do with attention. And I can't emphasize enough how important that is. In fact, when I first knew about this, the penny didn't entirely drop as to how profound that idea is.
So when you say attention, what do you mean by that?
Well, there is a problem of survival, which depends on being able to do something that is very difficult. It's to be able to pay attention to the world in two different ways at the same time.
Right.
And this is for, as I say, a very good reason that comes down to a matter of survival. If you imagine an animal needing to lock onto its prey, it's got to have its mind clearly set on one pursuit, one target, and when it finds it, its attention has got to be very precisely focused on that. Or you could think of a bird trying to pick up a seed against a background of grit or gravel. It's got to have very narrowly focused attention to that. And the same thing goes with trying to pick up a twig to build a nest. So in order to do the basics which involves some manipulation of the environment, get food, build shelter, you need very narrowly focused but very sharply focused attention. The trouble with that is that if that's all you're doing while you're getting your lunch, you become somebody else's.
That's right.
because you've got to have at one and the same time the complete opposite of this, an uncommitted attention as to what you may find. It might be an enemy, it might be your mate, and you need to have it global and to be able to see the whole picture at the same time. So you have to have, on the one hand, fragmentary, piecemeal, very narrow beam, very sharply focused attention, and very diffuse, large attention to the whole. And these, the solution to how you do this is the bihemispheric brain. And to cut a long story short, the left hemisphere is the one that offers this very detailed attention that enables you to manipulate, and the right hemisphere is the one that offers the broad, vigilant attention that gives you the context, the understanding of the whole, helps you to understand what's going on around you and to relate to it. And this is just as true in humans as it is of any other creature.
So some of the, just to make this as practical and accessible as I can, the interview, some of the notes that I took from your book about the left and the right was the left tends to be more fixed, the right more towards flow. The left takes thousands of points of information and tries to reach a conclusion about the whole picture that way. That's obviously a shortcoming of the left. The left only sees what it expects to see. This is more depth here. The left hemisphere is not in touch with reality, but with its representation of reality, which turns out to be remarkably self-enclosed.
Yes. Okay.
I'm just trying to get a very down-to-earth feel
I
of
know,
this.
but I'm also very keen not to be seen or said to be saying things that are simplistic. But there's some broad truth in all of those, as you stated them. And they flow from two things, really. From the left hemisphere's ability to focus narrow attention, and from its preoccupation with utility and survival. Yeah. And I know I'm talking about the hemispheres as though they were people, and they're not people. People often say that, but then you have to find a way of talking about them, and the alternative is to talk about them as though they're machines. The trouble is machines can't pay attention. Machines can solve problems and so on, but attention is an aspect of consciousness, and so it's no good thinking about it like that. You've got to think really more of...
But we actually do react and respond like machines a lot of the time, because we respond unless we have this awareness, attention, then we're going to respond just like machines, aren't we?
Well, you've made a good point, which is that the whole essence of being human is actually departing from a purely mechanical way of responding. So it's appropriate to think in terms of, it might be appropriate to think in terms of mechanism at a certain level of complexity. But when you get to looking at a whole human being, it isn't anymore. And the metaphor that you use, whether it's machine or animate being, a person, depends on how you understand the hemispheres, really. But to get back to what you were saying, if you contrast these two types of attention, they will give rise to two kinds of a world. And this is because how we attend to something changes what it is we find there. So if I look at those tulips as a painter, I will see one thing there. If I think of them as I would if I were a botanist, I see something else there. And there isn't one right way of thinking, but every kind of person, every person with their different values and different preoccupations, will see something slightly different there. And
in a way that attention is affected through knowledge, is that right?
Attention, there's a sort of cycle, which is a vicious one, if you like. It's called the hermeneutic circle, and it means that you narrow down through a process whereby expectation, suppose you expect to find a certain kind of thing there, then you will focus on those aspects, and that's what you will see. Yes. That will feed back, and next time you look at them, you will see more solidly that kind of experience, and that will, it feeds itself, it reinforces itself. So you can get stuck in a certain way of looking at things. But if you wanted some broad headlines, the right hemisphere tends to see the whole picture, where the left sees pieces. The right hemisphere tends to sustain an idea over time and is therefore more able to understand flow, whereas the left hemisphere tends to see it as an infinite sum of points in a sort of digitalized way,
Yes.
if you like. Which means it's not very good at understanding things that flow like music and time, and indeed human beings, because human experience and the human body even are better thought of as things that flow. The 19th century poet Novalis said, "We are embodied rivers. Our bodies are rivers that flow." And he was referring to the fact that although there's a form of me, there's nothing in my body now that was there, say, a couple of years ago. Everything has been replaced.
So would you say generally that a person tends to be more a right brain person than a left brain person? Is that a fair comment? And vice versa, obviously.
I don't particularly like that kind of remark. I think there is a sort of truth to it. You can, I mean, obviously at the very basic level, everybody's using all their brain all the time. So let's get that one clear. Whether you rely in your cognitive style, if you like to put it that way, on more the way the right hemisphere sees things or more the way the left hemisphere sees things, I think it does differ from individual to individual. But gross generalizations like he's a left hemisphere person or a right hemisphere person, I tend to distance myself from, because they're a little bit too crude. I'm really talking here not about an individual person, but about what capacities a human being has in order to understand the world. And if you like, many philosophical problems can be seen. One way of thinking about them is that the debate about them depends on whether you tend to think of the world as having the properties of a whole in which you can focus on individual areas which you see as connected to the whole, but not as discrete and separate, or whether you think of the world as made up from lots of little particles that have their existence outside of the whole that they go to make up.
Yeah, but also my own experience of that is, well, I feel my own experience of that is that with that knowledge that I can actually change the way I see things, insofar as I know you're not 100% keen on this, but I'm going to pursue it anyway.
Okay.
Insofar as that when I was reading the book, I looked at my own, what I feel my own thinking pattern, and there was times, and I kind of could be quite rigid in my own way, trying to solve a problem. Yeah. And I would read some of your explanation, the left hand side of the brain. I would thought, I'm definitely in the left hand side of my brain.
Yes.
I'm trying to solve a problem with all the bits,
yes,
and I haven't got a whole picture.
Yeah.
And then I might 3 hours later get nowhere with my problem, let's say, and I'm walking in the woods. I like you. I love to walk.
Yes.
Walking in the woods, and I feel more expanded. I'm looking at nature, and something changes, and I feel then, well, I'm probably more in the right hand side now. What's your response to that? Because in a way, isn't it helpful for people to see in themselves when they're...
I think it can be. I think that's absolutely right. If you like, what I aim to do is not so much to give people answers to problems, but to awaken their consciousness of different ways of thinking.
Yes.
And a lot of people have written to me saying things like, in reading your book, I became aware that I always think about the world in what I now can see is very much the way the left hemisphere would dictate that I should. But I understand I've been missing a lot of things, and indeed why I've misunderstood what a lot of other people mean by certain things. And they've even said to me, reading your book has actually changed the way I relate to people. My relationships have improved. I now understand other people's point of view better, and I'm even better at my job. So, I mean, I didn't write the book in order to achieve these things, but it is true that an individual can benefit from just seeing rather clearly, as one can by looking at the brain, the alternative ways of thinking about ourselves. And can I just gloss that? There are a lot of people who say there's nothing we can learn about ourselves from the brain that we couldn't know from introspection, from our minds. And in a way that can be true. I'm certainly not a fan of the sort of science of which there's far too much, where people think they've got to the bottom of it when they've described some brain circuits. So, you know, huge excitement. We found the brain circuits that light up when you fall in love. And the sort of implication is somehow we now know what love is. It's these circuits that light up. That reductionism is exactly the kind of thing that I would say only your left hemisphere would indulge in. And it's the part of the brain that sees least. So literally, in that the right hemisphere sees the broad picture and the left is looking at little bits and trying to understand it from that. So I'm not saying that, but there are things that it's very difficult to know until you look at the brain. And in our experience, as we live headlong day to day, we're not aware that our experience of the world is put together from these two essentially incompatible models. One, lots of bits that are put together to make up a mechanically constructed whole, and the other in which one sees a primarily united whole in which one can later roughly distinguish areas that are nonetheless interrelated. And so we're doing that all the time. But what the evidence from neuroscience enables us to see is that in fact we're synthesizing two kinds of thinking. And when we stop and think about the world as philosophers do, we've got to buy one sort of way of thinking or the other. We can't easily, at least if we're going to be consistent, put the two together because they're not entirely consistent. Our brains do a wonderful job of balancing them and alternating between them.
Okay, now the subtitle, well, the title of the book is The Master and the Emissary, the divided brain and the making of the Western world. So explain about the emissary part, so that you feel the left-hand side has got control of things to the detriment of mankind, basically.
Yes, I mean, we're rushing ahead there, but that is a conclusion that I draw, and I would need to unpack that a bit for it not to sound very strange. But what I'm suggesting is that there are these two ways of thinking about life that we're not aware of in consciousness as being separate. They're ways of not just thinking about, but experiencing the world, so at a pre-reflective level. And they lead to different conclusions. In one, you lead to a sort of vision of the world as atomistic, in other words, lots of little bits that sort of interact with one another, a bit like billiard balls, a sort of Newtonian mechanics view of what human society is and what of our place in the world is, if you like. But in the other, there is something that is a bit more like the world that modern physics tells us, that it is in principle uncertain. It is in principle impossible to isolate one thing entirely from everything else, and so forth. So in one world, things change according to their context. They change according to the way they're observed. They are not ultimately able to be taken out and isolated. You can temporarily do that in order to get a bit of knowledge about them, but you've got to relocate them in that context and so forth. So that is the right hemisphere's world, the one in which the context matters, but actually also uniqueness matters, because actually every experience is unique, that you never have the same experience twice, and no two people are the same, no two anythings are really the same. But in order to manipulate the world, we've got to think of it in categorical terms and to abstract, and it's the left hemisphere that does that. So it produces a very imperfect copy of the world, which enables us to get on with the business of daily life. It's rough and ready. It has the illusion of certainty. Because, you know, it's no good going out in the field and thinking, well, it might be a rabbit, but on the other hand, it could not be. Or that seed, is it a seed? Is it a piece of grape? You've got to go, it is, I'm getting it. So the left hemisphere's raison d'etre, if you like, the reason that evolution has, if one can say, express oneself so, has enabled us to have this, is it enables us to do a quick and dirty, black and white, certainty about existence. But when you become a human being and you reflect on experience, you realize that actually it's not as straightforward as that. That's where the right hemisphere comes in. Ramachandran, very well-known neuroscientist, says the right hemisphere is the devil's advocate, and I rather like that. So the left hemisphere is going, it's that. The right hemisphere is going, well, actually, it's a bit more complicated. The right hemisphere is interested in shades of meaning. It's interested in ambiguity. It's interested in the indirect, the implicit. And that may sound all very well, but we've got to get on with the business of life. Actually, our understanding of life depends ultimately on understanding implicit meaning, on understanding non-verbal meaning, reading faces and postures, understanding what's meant by metaphors, by tone of voice and so forth. So if you become the literalist, you become autistic essentially. You become like someone who suffers from autism. And one way of thinking about autism is that much of the ways that we think of the right hemisphere as interacting with the world has ceased to function well. Now, you said, I see the world as drifting that way. And what I mean is that, obviously not that in our lifetime, or even in the last 1,000 years, the brain has hugely altered. I mean, it will have altered, of course, because we're evolving all the time. But I'm not saying that if you put somebody 2,000 years ago into a brain scanner, you'd find their brain look substantially different from ours. It wouldn't. But I'm talking more about the way we use what our brain can offer us. Yes. It can offer us these two takes. And we seem to have got into a position where whenever all public discourse about the brain is governed by certain assumptions that we should control things, which is the left hemisphere. If you're going to manipulate, you have to, it's the bit of the brain that controls the right hand, which is the bit that grasps things and uses things. So it needs to be able to control things. It's interested in sharpening things up and fining them down, so making them certain and fixed as much as possible. And the right hemisphere is seeing something which is unique and is never going to happen again, but is also part of a complex whole, and is offering a different vision of the world. And in public discourse, as I say, we have now come to see the world as rather like a bureaucrat's dream, made up of lots of little entities that fall neatly into categories, that can be systematically manipulated for the good of all. That is rather like a complicated machine. And you hear scientists talk about this all the time. They say, oh, we're just very complicated machines, as though we were somehow one up from a computer, or a memory had anything like, our memories were anything like a computer's memory. These images or these words are being used in a very, very imprecise way. And all the differences that are so important are being left out, because our memory is nothing like a computer's memory, actually. Nor, of course, is what we experience in consciousness anything like what a machine has. Yeah. A machine doesn't have a body, which might sound just like an add-on, but in fact embodiment is a very, very important part of being human, not just about physical things, but about things like our emotional life, our intellectual life, our values. All of these things are ultimately rooted in a whole person that is partly embodied, a physical presence.
Yeah, to make it clear, which I don't think we've done, is that you see the master as the right-hand side. Is that correct?
In the image that I've adopted for the title, the right hemisphere is the master, and the left hemisphere is the master's emissary.
Yes.
And why I say this is that it's taken from a hint in Nietzsche, which is taken from this little fable about a spiritual master who looked after a community so well that it flourished and grew. And in time he realized that he couldn't look after all the affairs of this community. But he realized something more important than that. Not just that he couldn't do that, but that he mustn't do that. He mustn't even try to get involved with certain things, because certain ways of thinking and acting and being were actually incompatible with maintaining the overview and the degree of detachment that gave him the insight that made him the spiritual master. And so he appointed his brightest and best second in command to go about doing his business on his behalf. And that emissary, although very bright, wasn't quite bright enough. He thought, I know it all, which is always a mistake.
Well, yes.
And he didn't know what it was he didn't know. And so he thought, he became resentful. He thought, what does this master know, sitting there seraphically on his backside? back at the palace. I'm the one that knows everything. I'm the one that's in touch with things. I'm the one that, you know, does all the hard work. And so he went about wearing the master's cloak and saying he was the master. And the trouble is, he didn't know what he didn't know, and he didn't therefore take what he knew back to the master for it to be incorporated into what the master was able to know and do. And they were both impoverished by this, and the community failed to flourish. So that is really an image of the way the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere interact. They have a relationship, but the one that sees the whole picture and understands things and knows how to set things into context where they have real meaning is the right hemisphere. The left hemisphere, meanwhile, does certain things that the right hemisphere mustn't get involved with, because if it does, it starts getting narrow-focused. So it sends that, if you like. I mean, this is I'm not speaking literally. It's not that everything just is sent over to the left hemisphere and back, but in the communication between the hemispheres, what the right hemisphere first understands is unpacked with some detail by the left hemisphere, but that, importantly, needs to be reintegrated in the overall vision that the right hemisphere alone has. And a way of thinking about this is rather like learning a piece of music. Suppose you're a pianist. You pick up this music and you play it through a bit and you think, this is beautiful, I want to know this better. And then you think, well, in order to play it better, I've got to take it apart a bit. And there's that passage at bar 53, and you practice it over and over again. You see lots of little passages, and you get those going. And you look at the structure and you see, oh, I see, so here we have a return to the dominant and so forth. But when you come to play it, you must forget all of that, otherwise you'll give a very bad performance. So all that knowledge is not lost. It's simply taken up into the whole, where it animates and enriches the whole. The whole purpose of analytic thinking, it has a very important role in life. I'm not knocking it. I think it's, you know, hugely important. It's just that it's of second importance to what the right hemisphere does, which is to ground that whole experience and to interpret it at the highest level.
Okay, we've got about, I'm afraid time is flying as I knew it would. We've got about 10 minutes left, and I'd like to spend a little time about talking more about what's in your ebook, The Divided Brain and the Search for Meaning, because that for me really struck home in terms of how we were going as a society, you know, as a human race, and how we have, you start off by saying that in a way we have more than we ever had, yet we seem to be more unhappy than we've ever been. I may be oversimplifying there what you said, but just talk us through that, how you see the effect of what we're in effect doing with the brain in terms of the manifestation in our society.
Right. Well, I mean, I think many of the things that we would probably all agree we regret about modern life stem from having a utilitarian view, seeing the world as a heap of resource to be exploited without thinking about the broader consequences of this, or the long-term consequences. A sort of way of thinking in which we are keener on competition than on cooperation. But the reason I lit on this as to do with meaning is that meaning comes from understanding the whole. Meaning doesn't come from pursuing the little bit of, you know, for an animal lunch, or for us money. You know, getting is an important part of life. I'm not saying we shouldn't be engaged in doing that, but it's got to be part of a broader picture, which alone gives meaning. And even pursuing happiness is not really an end. I mean, there's some beautiful research which shows that just trying to make yourself happy in a hedonistic way will not make you happy. And it's only when you forget about that and actually start involving yourself with greater aims and with society and others as a whole. The responsiveness, what I call the betweenness of things, is where the life lies. And that issue that betweenness is important, the relations between things, not the things themselves, applies to everything. Yeah, because in one way, if we're not happy, it's intelligent to try and make ourselves more happy. But what you're saying is, and I think this is very, very true, that you can't just do that on an individual basis. No. By including the whole and being and seeing that you really are part of a bigger picture, that in itself, if you can get that, you're on your way, so to speak. You are on your way, and it illustrates also another fallacy, which is that if you can identify what it is you want and go for it, you'll get it. But actually some things are so constructed that the very business of focusing on them and going for them destroys the possibility of achieving them. And happiness is one of those things. The more you pursue it, the less you have it.
Yeah.
And that's true of many things in life, like going to sleep, or being modest, or being wise. So they're all things that come as a byproduct of something else.
I'll be sleeping. I'll be thinking about going to sleep. So anyway,
the harder you try.
It's true. The harder you
less
try,
it will be achieved. So there are many things, of course, that follow this pattern, and it's really more about the fact that you can't understand something at the outset by standing outside it in a detached way and analysing it and going, I don't see the point of that. There are many things that you will only see the point of when you're actually engaged with them at all. And spiritual things are very much of this nature, and I know that that's one of the focuses of interest for yourself. And there's a lovely story which a Jewish friend of mine told me, which is there's this rabbi who's praying. He says, you know, God, it's all very well, I'm committed to what I do, but I need money. I'm very poor, and really I need money. Can't you help me? Could I win the lottery? And he prays all the time, and he never wins the lottery. And anyway, one day he's praying, and this voice comes out of heaven, and it's the rabbi say, God, why do you never let me win the lottery? And this voice comes out of heaven and says, Mordecai, meet me halfway, buy a ticket. And there's a spiritual truth in that we don't, if we sit there waiting for spiritual truth to plop into our lap, it's not going to happen. It's only by putting yourself in the way of it happening, in other words, a disposition of openness to it happening, not a closed mind, that will allow you to experience something that once you've experienced it, you will understand fine, but ahead of time you won't. So that's just a gloss on part of that. But to go back to something that you mentioned earlier, and I think is important, I'd like to pick up. You said the right hemisphere is more in touch with reality than the left, and that might sound rather glib. But the point is this, going back to where we started, the point about the prefrontal cortex is being able to stand back a bit from life. And that can do two things. It can make you more engaged. So if you have a bit of distance from life, you can see the picture, and it enables you to build bonds, actually. If you're right up against things, you just bite. But if you can stand back and say, this is a suffering creature with whom I can make common ground, then that is empathy. And that is really what the right frontal cortex enables us to do, to be what Aristotle called the social animal, to be in touch with and connected and empathic. The left hemisphere enables us to make a map of the world in order to increase utility. But the trouble about a map is that its value depends on leaving most things out. A map that contains too much detail is no good. You want a quick and ready and somewhat sort of flavourless version of the world. And so we construct for ourselves a model of the world, which eventually we start to believe is reality. We mistake, in a famous phrase, the map for the territory, or I would say for the terrain, which is the thing we actually live in, rather than the territory, which is what we rule over. So in order to be able to do that, we need to get back to things that don't coincide with the model we've told ourselves about the world. That is extremely important.
And how do we do that?
Well, one of the ways we do it is by being aware of what we're getting wrong. And the purpose of my book is to open people's eyes. And from the quite extraordinary, lovely and gratifying responses that I've had from readers in every walk of life all over the world, it has done that for a lot of people. It's opened their eyes. You see, I'm a psychiatrist, and I know that if I tell you what to do, you won't do it. But if instead I lead you to the place where you can see what I've been doing all along has been unhelpful, but there's a thing, if I did that, it would work better. I want to lead people to that point.
So we have to make our own decisions, have our own realizations, basically.
We do, but there are things we could do, which are to do with our own spiritual lives, but also to do with the way we educate people and the way, indeed, we think about the role of government and so forth. And I'm in the process of trying to unpack that for a book I'm writing called The Porcupine is a Monkey.
Okay. So why is the porcupine a monkey?
Have you got a few minutes?
We've got about 3 minutes.
Right. Lovely experiment, which I think would be a nice note to end on. The experiment goes like this. You ask people to say, is this syllogism true? Now, a syllogism is a set of propositions leading to a conclusion. The classic one is, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, Socrates is mortal. It follows. Now, they gave that to a group of people in 3 conditions: the normal state, and once with the right hemisphere suppressed, and then with the left hemisphere suppressed. And in this example, one of these premises is wrong. It's false. So, all monkeys climb trees. True. The porcupine is a monkey. Untrue, clearly. The porcupine climbs trees. Well, it follows from the logic, but we know it's wrong. So you just ask, is it true? Now, in the intact state, the person replies, it's not right. A porcupine is nothing like a monkey. It goes on the ground. In the left hemisphere only state, the same individual on a different day, we're not aggregating data here, well we are, but we're looking at the same individual, okay, across time in each case. And that same person says it's true. And the examiner says, why? Don't you know a porcupine is nothing like a monkey? And she says, well, yes, I know that, but nonetheless it's true. Why? Because that's what it says on this sheet of paper. Mm. And when the right hemisphere is asked, it indignantly says, of course it's wrong, a porcupine is nothing like a monkey. Mm. Now, it seems to me that in the right hemisphere and normal state, we're aware that one meaning, a very important meaning of truth, is compare the model that I've been given with reality. In the other, what one means by truth, and it is a kind of meaning of truth, is internal consistency of the model. That's what it says on the sheet of paper, and therefore it follows. Now, my contention is we are moving into a world in which our models are more important than reality, and no amount of information about the reality sways us from what we believe. And the ticking of the box on the sheet of paper has become more important than the actual fact. And I have a beautiful illustration of this sent me by a reader. She said, a friend of mine heard her brother was dead. She went to the hospital and asked to see the body. She went into the morgue and felt the body. It was warm-ish. And she thought, this is unusual. This can't be right. And she thought she felt a pulse. So she went to the nurse who was standing by and said, I think my brother's alive. And she said, no, don't worry, dear. It's on this sheet of paper. He's dead. And she didn't wait. She ran out into the corridor where there was a passing doctor who came in, thought, my God, this person is alive, put adrenaline straight into his heart, and he's living today. It's a very vivid example of how the piece of paper becomes the reality. Hmm. And that is where the image of the porcupine is a monkey comes from, because we're believing that kind of nonsense all the time. Mm. I should actually say, just for those people who are watching who know a lot about porcupines, that annoyingly there are porcupines that climb trees. But you know, the people who did this experiment, neither the experimenters nor the subjects knew that. There we are.
Well, have you got faith that the human race is somehow going to find its way through and find a more balanced way of living?
I call myself a hopeful pessimist, by which I mean I fear it's too late, but I am hopeful because we can't predict. I can't predict. One of the wonderful things about humans is we're not machines and we can't easily be predicted. And there have been many times in the past where one would have thought, gosh, it's going to be all up with the human race now. And in fact, one couldn't have predicted changes in the history of ideas that have perhaps happened only a decade or two later. So I respect the resilience and the capacity for flexibility and imagination of the human race. And what I know from my own experience, everywhere I go, people say we're tired of the old paradigm, we're tired of hearing this reductionist nonsense, which is actually stuck in the 19th century. We're not machines, it's not just genes propagating themselves. Most of the story of life is left out there. And so I know that people are ready to understand differently. And that gives me hope for the future.
Iain, it's been fascinating. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks very much for watching Conscious TV. Iain has got 2 books out. There's the e-book I talked about, The Divided Brain and the Search for Meaning, and of course his weighty tome here, 400,000 words, The Master and His Emissary, The Divided Brain and the Making of the Western World. Thank you and goodbye.